General, it's great to have you. Welcome, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, Ron, thank you. May I first of all thank you for inviting me this evening and for your very warm and generous introduction. Can I say that perhaps unsurprisingly, this is the first talk that I've given by Zoom. Indeed, I'd not heard of Zoom 4 months ago, but I now seem to live my life on Zoom. And I expect many of you are the same. And I'm very grateful to Ron for giving me the flexibility to choose my own title this evening, so long as it was broadly on the theme of living as a Christian in the army. So the title I've chosen is Leading from the Heart, Faith in Action. And having been a soldier for 40 years and having got into a number of scraps, I thought that leadership would be a suitable focus to talk about faith and action. Actually, before I go any further, I should say that I nearly did not become a soldier at all. Those older and wiser than me at school, in my last year at school, told me that I should apply to go to Cambridge with the view of reading law and becoming a barrister. Well, this was helpful advice, and as a young man who looks up to their elders, I thought I would probably take that advice, and duly did. And I applied to Cambridge, and I was quite surprised to be called for an interview. And someone said to me, well, if you're going to read law, one question you're bound to be asked is, do you do any law reading? And the really good answer to give is, yes, that you read the law reports in the Times. Well, I remembered that, and I thought the interview was actually going quite well. And then the question came, do you do any law reading? Yes, sir, I heard myself say, I read the law reports in the Times. Well, what about, what cases have interested you recently? And I thought for a moment, and quickly as I could, thinking back in the late 1960s, the Bodies on the Moor trial. And I thought, well, well done. You've managed to remember a legal case. And then he said to me, and what about that trial did you find so interesting? I thought, hold, this is getting a little bit below the belt here. As quickly as I could, I said, well, the fact that the criminals have got away with it for so long. And I thought, you've done really well. And then he looked over his half glasses at me and he said, I think, Mr. Dannatt, you might be better suited to joining the police force than reading law in this college. So it was not to Cambridge that I went, it was to Sandhurst. And that's what I really wanted to do. Thus, it was to Sandhurst rather than Cambridge, and a military career was the one that I chose. So let me focus my remarks this evening around leadership, as that is what I wound up doing for 40 years. Because it seems to me that leadership, at a time of intense political turbulence, amidst the coronavirus pandemic, at a time of deep economic uncertainty, and a time of much personal uncertainty for many years, whether as soldiers on the battlefield, healthcare workers in our hospitals, or ordinary citizens going about their daily business, that leadership is a subject that impacts on all of us. Many were the times during my army career that the faces turned to me with the unspoken question, what do we do now? And if leadership is to be of any real value, if leaders are to really earn their pay, then it's in turbulent times like today that their real qualities will out, where the real value will be added, and not when everything is going swimmingly and according to plan. So I would suggest that leadership is for turbulent times, and such times are the context in which effective leaders should thrive for the benefit of those around them. After all, where in the history books would Winston Churchill have sat without the threat from Hitler's National Socialism in 1940? Or where would Margaret Thatcher have been without the challenge from Argentina in 1982? Of course, not only do we all recognise that leadership is an important subject, but I suspect we can also agree it's a difficult area. Discussion has long raged as to whether leaders are born or made, and if they're made, how is it done, and what qualities and characteristics should they exhibit. But whether leadership is gifted or acquired, perhaps it's more useful to consider what leaders actually do. Now, not surprisingly, and I've already suggested, I first came across leadership as a subject to be considered formally while I was a cadet at Sandhurst. It was treated differently to the other subjects that we studied. For leadership discussions, we didn't sit in the classroom in the serried ranks, but we sat around in armchairs in the company bar, the anteroom as we called it. And we were asked for our ideas, as opposed to just being told what to do and what to think. And I believe that immediately sets leadership apart. It's a personal thing, it's an individual thing, it's an intuitive thing. But despite that, I don't go as far as to subscribe to the notion that leaders are born, not made. Yes, of course, a bit of leadership natural ability helps. But if someone has any leadership ability, then thinking about the subject, studying the subject, experimenting, modeling yourself on a leader you respect, all those things can really pay dividends. But when we sat in our chairs at Sandhurst, we had a range of what we thought were fairly erudite discussions. On the one hand, listing the qualities of a leader, and on the other hand, debating the merits of a more functional approach to leadership techniques. I recall extensive discussion about the thoughts of a former head of the army, the late Field Marshal Lord Harding, who produced an impressive list of the qualities in his view to be exhibited by a good leader, based of course on his own experiences. He said a good leader needed absolute fitness, complete integrity, enduring courage, daring initiative, undaunted willpower. And interestingly, as an aside, he stressed the adjectives as well as the nouns: absolute fitness, complete integrity, enduring courage, daring initiative, undaunted willpower. And to these he added 3 other prerequisites: knowledge, judgment, and team spirit. Now, all that's good stuff from a soldier's perspective, you're probably thinking, certainly applicable in the battle space. But I suggest probably also widely applicable in the business space, the community space, and elsewhere. But as respected and useful as possession of a large number of key qualities is, our discussions at Sandhurst also turn to other ways of thinking about leadership. At that time, Professor John Adair had developed what he called action-centered leadership, which he illustrated with a classic 3 balls Venn diagram. And his model required the identification of the need to blend identifying and achieving the task while maximizing the efforts of the team, and most critically, looking after the interests of the individuals. And those 3 things to us all seemed like a winning formula. And I think that single construct of task, team, individual, all coming together still retains great merit. But one wonders, is that enough? Now, while a dry debate about the merits of a qualities approach to leadership or a functional approach is quite interesting for some, it remains essentially theoretical and by definition, perhaps not that compelling. However, I think a more important question that roots this discussion of leadership rather more is to analyze what it is that leaders are actually trying to do. And to answer that, I suggest there is a need to have an understanding of what level of activity the leader is trying to lead within and at. Now, in my sphere of work, we separate out activity into 3 levels: the strategic, the operational, and the tactical. Now, the first and the last of those levels, I think, are well known. The strategic level is where the big thoughts are thought, and where every business endeavor or large organization seems to be well supplied with strategic thought. Strategies for this, strategies for that. Probably, actually, if we're honest, too many strategies. And then down below, where it all happens, is tactics, where the rubber hits the road. And in this sense, the tactical level is all about delivery. It's widely held that 20% of a business is about strategy, and the other 80% is delivery. But critically, the glue that holds it all together is communication. Successfully communicating the big idea to those who have to make it happen. And if communication is delivered by leaders or managers who know their staff, who can inspire their staff, can drive through to their objectives, then this is probably another commendable formula. But in my construct, this overlooks the key level. And this is the operational level, which sits between the strategic and the tactical, and which is the level that sits between the ideas and the action. It's the level which turns the ideas into action. And in my book, that is the level which lifts the mediocre to the exceptional. It's the level that lifted Nelson, Wellington, and Montgomery, if you like, into the history books, and the likes of Bill Gates, Richard Branson, whoever you like, into the world's rich list. Because it's at this operational level where the general or the captain of industry does his real work, where an end-to-end plan is formulated to transform the original idea, the big idea, into success on the battlefield or to serious profit on the balance sheet. And it requires intellectual rigor to do this, to devise a plan, a campaign plan, to take one in a series of steps, which we in the army would call battles or engagements, to that pre-identified end state, and on to success in the campaign. But the compilation of the plan is nothing without the application of energy, drive, and inspiration to take the team on the journey. And this aspect of leadership is key. And it begs the question, will those who are integral to your plan actually come on the journey with you? Because leadership is one thing, but successfully promoting followership is another. And to arrive with no one behind you is a very lonely experience. And many a young officer has been followed merely out of curiosity. But then the question is, how to do all this? In my organization, this is where I am a victim of my own experience. We exercise leadership through a process which we call mission command. And we aim to do this both in peacetime training and on operations in the field. But I'd apply the principle more widely still. Now that said, in a general sense, I think I've already touched on the key elements of this. But essentially there are three components to what we call mission command, and they all hinge around this person, around the leader. First, the commander, the senior manager, the leader, needs to think through his problem and convert his strategic goals into the front end of his operational or campaign plan. And this results in him clearly setting out his intent with a capital I. He needs to have applied sufficient analysis and intellectual rigor so he can set out to his subordinates or his employees his statement of what needs to be done and his overall intentions as to how it's to be done. This, I suggest, is more than just a rather wishy-washy statement on the company office wall. The second stage, in a non-prescriptive way, is to separate out the tasks that need to be done and delegate them to subordinates along with the necessary manpower, equipment, and financial resources to carry out those tasks. But he doesn't tell them what to do, he tells them what they are to achieve. So this is very much output or outcome focused, not input focused. And finally, and this is where the process can go wrong, having delegated the task appropriately, he needs to supervise the execution of those tasks, not in a way that stifles the initiative of the subordinates to whom the tasks have been delegated, but in a subtle way, and remembering that while tasks can be delegated, responsibility can never be delegated. The buck always stops with the boss. Actually, without going down a rabbit hole unduly, I think that the relationship between the ownership of the plan and the responsibility of that plan and its consequences came home to me most starkly in July 2000, when I gave evidence for the prosecution at the trial of one Radovan Krstić before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. General Krstić had commanded the Drina Corps of the Bosnian Serb army at the time of the capture of Srebrenica and the subsequent massacre in eastern Bosnia in July 1995. He was about the same age as me, had a professional military background in the then Yugoslav National Army that had begun at the same age as mine had in the British Army, and in 1995 was commanding a formation very similar in size and organisation to the 3rd UK Division, which I was then commanding. His mistake on the 13th of July 1995 was to accept a mission from his superior and then develop a plan that ultimately led directly to the massacre of 7,000 to 8,000 Muslim men and boys. He had accepted ownership of the plan, ownership of the operation, and therefore became responsible for the plan. Defence in court on having delegated his responsibility, and was quite properly convicted and sentenced to 42 years imprisonment for a variety of war crimes. When we say glibly, the buck stops here, for Radovan Krstić, it stopped for him in spades on the day he was convicted. Now that said, as an aside to my aside, I know, he knows, and the court also knows that his real failure was the complete collapse of personal moral courage. Had he refused to accept the mission from General Ratko Mladic, and they were at the Yugoslav War Academy together, or talked his superior out of the idea that he would not be in prison now, and upwards of 8,000 people would still be alive. Yes, the risks of the morally correct line were obviously high, but on the day, he failed the test. Now, Viscount Hambledon, who founded the W.H. Smith business empire, also had much to say on leadership. And one of his key contentions was that character and integrity are as important in a manager or leader as capability. And I sense that I've already touched on both aspects of character and integrity in what I've said so far. A leader does indeed need certain qualities, to which integrity is key. And at the same time, there are certain capabilities that a leader needs as well: to understand the objectives, to map out this route from strategic end state to tactical decisions, and above all, to communicate his intent clearly while delegating responsibly, but knowing he never delegates responsibility. But I wonder if these qualities and capabilities that I've suggested are enough. Fitness, integrity, courage, initiative, willpower, these things and more are really important. But are they enough? Indeed, the British Army, which it was my privilege to lead for 3 years until August 2009, identified 6 core values for itself, which are at the heart of the ethos of the Army. These values define us and what we do. Indeed, they're so important to us that we now educate our soldiers formally in those core values. Values that in a previous generation, they may well have been expected to have picked up in their family or wider community. But we can't make that assumption today. But I wonder, even if these 6 core values, selfless commitment, courage, discipline, integrity, loyalty, and respect for others, wonder if they themselves are enough. Well, my own feeling is that a range of leadership qualities and those core values provide a very sound moral baseline, a baseline that makes sense to a lot of people. But the next question is whether a sound moral baseline is enough. After all, a sound moral baseline is largely a thing of the head. Should there not also be a spiritual dimension to this? Surely should there not be something driven by the heart? I believe there should. And of course, it's that word believe or belief that's at the heart of any spiritual dimension. For some, belief in the cause, belief in the leader, or even in my organization within the tribal nature of the British Army, belief in the regiment will be enough. But I'm not so sure. What really sustains, in my view, is something far more than this, something far bigger than ourselves, something bigger and deeper than we can imagine or rationalize for ourselves. I think this first came home to me as a young platoon commander in Belfast in the early 1970s. My platoon of 30-odd soldiers and I got caught up in a vicious and protracted gunfight that lasted several hours. At the end of the day, at least 2 gunmen and 1 of my soldiers had been killed. And although we didn't admit it to each other, we'd all been scared pretty witless at one stage or another during the day. But that experience told me, and it's been shared by many in Iraq and Afghanistan in recent times, that even the toughest of men, when the chips are down and the reality of life and death confronts, then people are reaching out into the spiritual dimension, beyond the rational and beyond the moral. And I think interestingly, as we sit here this evening, there may well be British soldiers and other soldiers of other nations on operations in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and parts of Africa, potentially laying down their lives on the line on behalf of their nation, our nation. At this moment, it's very likely that some of them will be facing issues of life and death, making instant decisions about who lives and who dies. Better than anyone else, the close proximity of death in battle and a yearning for life itself. When death confronts, then the bigger issues of life become very clear. None of us knows when death will confront us. The only certainty we have in life is that one day it will. I read this account a few years ago of a young soldier who had just shot his first enemy fighter in Afghanistan. He wrote this: "Afterwards, I sat there and thought, hang on, I just shot someone. I had a brew and that. I didn't get to sleep that night. I just lay there all night thinking, I shot someone. Something strange. A really strange feeling. You feel like, a bit happy with yourself. It's my job. It's what I've come here for. You know what I mean? He's Taliban and I got one of them. And you feel quite chuffed about it. Then you're feeling like, sad. You're thinking, well, the geezer's another human being at the end of the day, like. Then you get the feeling, well, it's either him or me. Then you're thinking, I think people get religious as well then. You're thinking, well, in the bigger picture, if there is a geezer up there and a geezer downstairs, what does that mean for now? For me now? I've just shot someone. Is that me done for? Am I going to hell or what? And all of that went through my mind that night, for hour after hour after hour. It's often said there are no atheists in a foxhole, and none of us know when we're going to meet our maker. But if there is a geezer up there and a geezer downstairs, I'm absolutely certain that I know which of the two I want to meet, and that's the God of love and hope up there. But I don't think this just applies to armies in a combat situation, but I think there is an application to any situation of pressure, stress, or challenge when individuals have stretched their physical or psychological limits. Where do you go to when you've lost your job, or your firm has gone bust, or your investments are now worthless, let alone when your comrade is shot dead beside you, or a close family member has lost their life to COVID-19? I think the truly effective leader needs to recognize this question. But he or she is, of course, personally challenged to provide what is needed, especially if he does not have some empathy with or some experience of the spiritual dimension to their own life. Where does the leader go to provide strength and guidance for those he or she is responsible for? So this is a very personal thing, but any of us in these difficult circumstances should remember we're not the first to have trodden this path. One aspect of leadership development, accepting that others may have trod the path where we now step, is the identification and deliberate modeling on someone that's really respected as a leader. In my experience, a number of people left a lasting impression on me. I recall a brigade commander, a brigadier, a wonderful man, but with a fearsome temper, no fuse at all, which had the effect of really scaring the young officers when he lost it, such as their performance rapidly nosedived. But I also recall a brilliant battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, again with a fearsome reputation. But if you made a mistake, he would explain, teach, and encourage you to get it right next time. However, a repeat of that mistake was probably best avoided. But if we're lifting the discussion to a spiritual dimension, then there is one obvious role model to look at, as far as I'm concerned, and that's to look at the person and example of Christ himself. Christians, quite rightly, put huge emphasis on the death and resurrection of Christ, but his life also provides the model that I believe leaders will do well to try to emulate. The motto of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst is "Serve to lead." I think that Christ in his lifetime is a very, very clear example of that maxim. When Christ washed his disciples' feet, he was doing the most menial and humble task. And by serving his disciples, he was earning the right to lead them. He would ask of others nothing that he would not do himself. And his style of leadership, it was to say quite simply, "Follow me." It was not said in a macho way, but it was said in a way that gave people the opportunity to look at him, to look at what he stood for, to look at what he promised, and to decide for themselves whether to follow him or not. And this is key, since, as I've already said, the flip side of leadership is followership. Is to make people out of their own free choice follow, not out of curiosity, but out of belief and confidence that the direction of travel is right and that the objective is worth the cost along the way. Because following his Father's plan and doing what he had to do cost Jesus Christ his life. but his belief and confidence in his Father's plan led to him opening up the way to peace and purpose in this life and life beyond for those who are prepared to put their trust in him. In my former business, asking people to risk their lives is part of the job, but doing so without giving them the chance to understand the meaning of life and death, I believe, is something of a dereliction of our wider duty of care to our people. And therefore, I think there's very much an obligation on the leader, certainly on a Christian leader, to include a spiritual dimension into his people's general conduct of their lives, and in my case, their preparation for potentially life-changing operations. Qualities and core values are fine as a universally acceptable moral baseline for leadership, but the unique life, death, resurrection, and promises of Christ provide that spiritual opportunity that I believe takes the privilege and the demand of leadership to another level. But if a leader, or indeed a follower, is going to take that privilege and demand to a high level, I believe we need to be properly equipped for that. And as a military man, I would say that we need a personal concept of operations, a framework for one's own life to make sense of the turbulent times around us. And I suggest we need to consider three things, and they are themselves pretty demanding. We need to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to be obedient to God, committed to Christ, and open to the Holy Spirit. Let me offer a couple of thoughts on each of those three propositions. Before I do that, I'm conscious that the westerly sun here in Norfolk is now shining on my face. It will go down. So I'm not experiencing some kind of awful thing. It's just the sun going down over the River Yare. Those three things: obedient to God, committed to Christ, and open to the Holy Spirit. Obedient to God. Consider the well-known story of Gideon in Judges chapters 6 to 8. On God's instructions, Gideon, despite being faced by a huge tactical problem, reduced his army from 22,000 to 10,000 and finally to just 300 men. On God's instructions, he endorsed an amazing concept of operations, deploying his tiny force at night, a force equipped more like the regimental band and the quartermaster's department than crack troops. And the result was that 135,000 Midianites were defeated with 125,000 casualties. This was a fantastic victory stemming from obedience to God. And of course, I could quote so many other examples. But listening to God and doing what he prompts you to do is the baseline. Remember the boy Samuel in the temple. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. But hearing is one thing, doing is another. And what Christ wants from us is full commitment and not a half-hearted compromise. I've been down that track and I know it doesn't work. But okay, I accept. Commitment is so much easier to talk about than to put into practice. And forgive me for talking very personally for a couple of minutes. In my last couple of years at school, I made two decisions that materially affected my life. One, as I said earlier, was that I wanted to be a soldier. And the second was that I wanted to follow Christ. And I made a decision to try to do that. As I've already said, I found this was a much easier thing to say than to do. And if I'm being honest, I was a pretty unsatisfactory Christian, too often compromising what I believed in and not living up to the standards that Christ had set. To use the obvious analogy, I was a very half-hearted Christian soldier. Now, even at the time, I knew that the way I was living my life was wrong, and that to be effective for Christ, I had to let him have complete control of my life. But it was too difficult. Or so I thought, until one day, 8 years after I joined the army and just 6 months after I was married, I had a major stroke. I was almost completely paralyzed on one side and carted off to hospital with blue lights flashing. My wife and I were stationed in Berlin at the time, and the German consultant in the main hospital there said to my bride of 6 months that night, "'Tis how you say in England, 50-50, we win some, we lose some." Well, the shock of that really concentrated my mind, because at the point that I thought I might lose my life, I realized how I had wasted so much of it up to then. As I gradually recovered, my thoughts kept taking me back to my relationship with God, and I realized then how half-hearted I had been. As I thought things through, I realized that on several occasions in the past, God had challenged me about my half-hearted commitment to him. I remembered that particular day in 1973, towards the end of that particularly violent and difficult day on operations in Belfast, which I talked about earlier, and how the day had ended when two gunmen outflanked the temporary position I'd taken up as my platoon command position and opened fire. And what seemed like a hail of bullets leapt down the street. The corporal on my left, who I was in the process of briefing, fell with a bullet in the chest, and my driver, who was kneeling down beside my vehicle, acting as a sentry, was hit in the back, and later, very sadly, tragically, he died. When I got back to barracks that evening, that night, after the operation was ended, many conflicting thoughts and emotions crowded in, but one kept recurring. Had I just been very lucky, or was someone trying to say something to me? Should I take advantage of my fortune's escape and perhaps sort out my relationship with God? But after a while, as a young man does, I just shrugged it all off. Days, weeks, and months went by until some 2 years later, this time operating from Crossmaglen in the border area of South Armagh in Northern Ireland, my company was carrying out an operation to neutralize a large improvised explosive device near a crossroads. My company commander and I moved forward with the bomb disposal team to show them what we thought was a safe vantage point for them to start their work. As we moved forward, my company commander stopped me and gave me an air photograph, telling me to stay where I was and study it in preparation for another operation in the same area that weekend. He and the others went on. They'd only gone another 30 yards when some half a minute later, there was a tremendous explosion. And I looked through the clouds of dirt and falling debris to see that all four had been instantly killed. Again, that night, back in Crossmaglen police station, I wondered, had I just been lucky, or was this another chance to get sorted out with God? But once more, after a while, I just shrugged it off. But 2 years later in Berlin, I could not shrug anything off. It was me this time who was paralyzed, who was frightened, unable to speak or move or shrug anything off. And as I lay in hospital, I found myself in the unusual position of being a spectator on life, unable to move, with plenty of time to think. I received many letters from friends, one from an elderly retired major in the Coldstream Guards, who one or two may have known years ago, who lived near us at home in Norfolk. Bill Batt suggested that I looked at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, and then later to look at verse 11. The first two verses read, "My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor lose courage when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines him whom he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives." And to start with, if I'm honest, I was a little irritated by that. But I gradually realized that having decided earlier in my life that I wanted to try to follow Christ, God had accepted me then as a son. However, in intervening years, I had often let him down and I'd compromised what I professed to believe in. And then, as Bill Batt invited me, I turned to verse 11, and it read, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Now, as it happens, the day I was taken ill was the 11th of November, 1977. We all remember that the 11th of November each year is the anniversary of Armistice Day, when at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the surrender of Germany to end the First World War was announced. But a surrender is two things. It's the end of the fighting and the beginning of the peace. After years of fighting with my Creator, compromising and ignoring his challenges, I found that a far better way of life was to commit myself wholeheartedly to him, to surrender my will to his will, and thereby gain the peace and purpose in life that only complete trust in Jesus Christ can give. But obedience and commitment, I don't think, are enough unless transformed by the enabling power of the Holy Spirit. One of my favorite Bible passages is the closing verses of John's Gospel, chapter 14, especially verse 27. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, I give to you." And to me, this verse really helps make sense of the turbulent times in which we live. But that passage from John's Gospel 14 also contains these verses. These things I have spoken to you while I'm with you. But the Counselor, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. And here Jesus is saying that the Father will send the Holy Spirit to those who are obedient to God, committed to Christ, and prepared to be open to the Holy Spirit. Because the Father wants us to use the abilities that we've been given to work to bring peace to the lives of individuals, whether we're doing so as a leader at the strategic or operational levels, or as a fighter at the tactical level. The Holy Spirit will guide, direct, and inspire us if only we are open to him. And I think these three aspects, obedience to God, commitment to Christ, and openness to the Holy Spirit, are like three interlocking balls of another Venn diagram, but with the center section still blank. I firmly believe that the focus, the blank space that makes sense of all this, is the cross of Christ. And to be truly effective as a leader or foot soldier, the cross, must be at the center of our lives. Kneeling at the foot of Christ's cross is the recruiting office where our spiritual journey and duty begins. This is where our spiritual pilgrimage is focused and where the real challenge of spiritual warfare begins. Jesus lived as the perfect man, died on the cross, taking the weight of our sin on his shoulders, but rose again, breaking the power of death and guilt and sin. And in doing so, he charted the path to peace, everlasting peace, peace with justice for those who believe and trust in him. It's my experience that an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ at the cross changes lives. It can change individuals, and it can have a strategic effect, not only on individuals, but through individuals, on the lives of communities and nations. And the cross also brings peace, God's peace, to those prepared to meet Christ on the cross and to surrender their lives to him, to say, not my will, but thy will for my life. So time's run on, and I apologize. Let me just try and pull these thoughts together, leading from the heart, faith in action. There are traditional ways of understanding and developing leadership. The qualities approach and the functions approach of it too. But in today's more complex environment, in both the business space, the community space, and the battle space, I believe there needs to be more, much more. I contend the leader needs to analyze very carefully at any moment in time what he or she is trying to do and at what level of leadership. The strategic, the operational, and the tactical levels of activity make different demands on the leader, and he or she needs to know this and understand the differences. But what really gives the leader his authority, his right to lead, does at the end of the day come down to him or her as a person, and it's the nature of their character and the degree of their integrity. And this is very different from some media-enhanced image. In my book, as far as I'm concerned, character defines the person and answers the question as to whether this is someone to emulate or to follow, and with what enthusiasm. Moreover, integrity establishes the moral baseline to lead, the thing of the head. Is this someone who can be trusted? Is this someone whose instructions are honorable? Is this someone to commit to? Do they really have legitimate interests at heart? Or is this person simply a self-seeker and merely interested in the bottom line? These are all judgments for the subordinates, the employees, the followers, the voters to make. Their judgments, I submit, will ultimately define success or failure in the enterprise. Perhaps not in the short term, but most certainly in the medium to long term. So the onus is on the leader to lead from the heart. The employees, the subordinates, the followers in these turbulent times may increasingly turn to him or her and ask, what do we do now? He or she may understand leadership theories, but if he or she may have embraced core values that provide a sound moral baseline, but is that enough? It's my experience that without a spiritual dimension to one's life and leadership, there is something lacking, something from the heart. And it's up to each of us to work out what that spiritual dimension is on a personal basis. But it's what or who that is in our hearts that will direct what we do with our heads, and with our strength in these turbulent times when leadership is most definitely required. Leading from the heart will turn faith into action. It's my experience that a life which is obedient to God, committed to Christ, and open to the Holy Spirit sustains and guides in these turbulent times. But, and there is no getting away from it, leading such a life comes at a cost. Remember Christ's words in Mark 8, verse 34. If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. There is no doubt that there is a cost to following Christ today. Such a path is countercultural to many in our increasingly secular society. But if that cost seems daunting, then remember too the promise of God in Revelation 2, verse 10. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now that is really worth aiming for in these turbulent times.